This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
If you are not one of us, you are one of them.
What are they?
They are everyone, and they are no one. But they are the gatekeepers. They are guarding all the doors. They are holding all the keys, which means that sooner or later, someone is going to have to fight them.
Someone? What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets?
No. I'm trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters. The very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it. Were you listening to me, Neo? Or were you looking at the woman in the red dress?
I was...
Look again. Freeze it.
Good evening, and thank you for joining me. I'm Monique Lessan, your private investigator host with Matrix of Perception on Revolution Radio, where the truth always wins. Revolution Radio is the only 100% listener-supported radio, so please go to our website, www.freedomslips.com, and click Donate. If you want to contact me directly, please go to my website at iinvestigate.com and state your questions. Our dedicated dial to listen numbers available 24/7 for Studio A is 712-432-6958. And if you'd like to join the conversation, call us at 347-688-2902 or simply call us at my producer's phone number, 206-855-3056. You can also Skype us at Freedom Screen. My co-host tonight is Dan Willis, who is one of the Disclosure Project top secret military witnesses, and his website is www.thewebmatrix.net. Tonight, my special guest is former Minister of Defense of Canada, Honorable Paul Hellyer. He is one of Canada's best known and most controversial politicians. He has achieved the rank of senior minister, which was later designated Deputy Prime Minister. Although Hellyer is best known for the unification of the Canadian Armed Forces and for his 1968 chairmanship of the Task Force on Housing and Urban Development, he has maintained a lifelong interest in macroeconomics and has written several books on the subject. In recent years, he has become interested in the extraterrestrial presence and the superior technology that we have been emulating. In September 2005, he became the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 group of countries to state explicitly UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. He has written 3 books. First, America in Waiting, Economics That Would Make Sense, Light at the End of the Tunnel. Both are available at Author House USA. And a third one, and the most recent, is Survival Plan for Human Species, The Money Mafia, which is World in Crisis. Available at Amazon.com. His website, paulhellyerweb.com. Thank you so much for joining me, Honorable Paul Hellyer.
It's my pleasure.
So, Paul, how do you say your last name exactly the way you want it?
How do I say it?
Yes.
Hellyer.
Hellyer.
Yes.
I just want to make sure that I said it right because I do have an accent. So, Dan, thank you for joining me as my co-host tonight.
This is exciting. I've been looking forward to the show with Paul, and I think 2 hours is going to fly by. with all the questions.
I know, I know. So let's start with Paul. I'm sure, if you don't mind just me calling you Paul, what made you want to go public with your information, and how has that affected your political life?
Well, the reason was that after reading Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, I said to myself, there are huge issues here that affect the future of the United States and maybe the future of the world, and no one's talking about them. They're not in the public domain, and they should be, because they can affect the lives and futures of people everywhere. So I decided that even though I was not a ufologist and never will be, and don't pretend to be, that I had a responsibility to go public and to say that UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead, and to see if it was possible to get a little bit of discussion in the public domain, to see if people would talk about it and want to find out the truth about it. Well, it's a very difficult uphill struggle, because the people that have the information about these subjects are quite determined to keep as much of it as possible undercover. And so a little bit leaks out from time to time. And you have a lot of ufologists who are writing books and making speeches and going on radio and television and convincing a certain number of people. But the official line is still either that UFOs don't exist, or if they do exist, that the United States government is not interested in them because they don't pose a threat to U.S. security. Well, both of those things are incorrect, because the U.S. government is very interested. It has been very interested since, well, I guess probably before 1947, but certainly certainly from 1947. And they have spent trillions of dollars in the process of trying to back engineer the flying saucers and to learn the technologies and later to develop the weapons and all of these things. But they just don't want to share that information with either the taxpayers who have been putting up the money, or with the rest of us who would like to know what is going on and in what way it might affect our futures.
Mm-hmm. So what did you personally see on documentations of UFO reports and contact or reverse engineering while you were in government?
Well, the only things I saw when I was in government were sighting reports. And they were very similar to ones in other countries. I remember discussing this with Ted Pope.
Nick Pope?
Nick Pope, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Soon after I went public, my wife and I joined a couple of people to go to the Middle East to see for ourselves what was going on there.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick had sent me an email saying he would like to get together. So I just said, well, we're going to stop in London on our way to the Middle East. Why don't we have lunch?
Right.
And he thought it was a great idea, so we did. And he told me that their experience with the sightings was very similar to the Canadian experience.
Mm-hmm.
But about 80% of the sightings were natural phenomena and were identified as such. But about 15 or 20% were not. And they were, the only thing you could say about them is they were unidentified flying objects,
right.
UFOs. And so the other thing that Nick did for me when I was over there, he gave me a file on the Rendlesham Forest case.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my first major introduction into a specific case, and one that I followed up later and had a marvelous interview with Charles Halt, Colonel Halt, the deputy commander. And that was, I reported that almost verbatim in my first book, Light at the End of the Tunnel.
Right.
because it covered so many aspects of the whole thing. You know, the uncertainty, the business of don't give us that guff, and the Colonel Halt on Christmas Eve or whenever it was that he was asked by his boss to go out and check out an alleged sighting or an alleged landing, said to himself, I'm going to go out and put an end to this nonsense once and for all. Well, he didn't. He went out and saw what was there, and it changed his life forever.
Right.
And of course, as you know, he's gone public since then, and he's been on the circuit of speakers, and the Rendlesham Forest case has probably become one of the most well-known and the best documented of all the landing sites.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I met Nick Pope, and I saw his presentation in Laughlin, Nevada, in 2015 when he was speaking about that. So that whole experience in Rendlesham Forest, for example, it's our connection and communication with extraterrestrials, or them with us.
Well, wasn't the only connection at all. Before I went public, when I was, as you suggested, reading the book on my holiday, and I just got into this business really by accident, or sometimes I think things don't happen by accident, that it was meant to be.
Right.
Anyway, there was a young man in Ottawa, a young bilingual man, the name of Pierre Junot. And Pierre kept sending me stuff on this subject. And I was honest with him. I said, Pierre, I haven't got time to read it. And he said, well, just put it on a shelf, and perhaps there will be a rainy day when you might have the opportunity. And he sent me a copy of this book. And I said, well, that looks interesting. I could make that my summer reading sometime at the little lodge in Muskoka in the Lake District, about 120 miles north of Toronto. And so I decided that I should do that. But then when summer came, I couldn't find it. So I had to read The Life of Pi instead. Of course, it was very entertaining, and I didn't know until nearly the end whether it was fact or fiction.
Right.
The following year, I was looking for another book, couldn't find it. But there, staring me in my face, was The Day After Roswell. So I took that, and I started to read it. And as you know from reading my book, I was partway through when my nephew came along and said, what are you reading? And I told him. He said, well, I'm a skeptic. So I said, well, that's okay. It's still a free country, more or less. I guess more getting less all the time.
Right.
And so he went home, and 1 or 2 days later, he phoned me and said, I phoned the general and told him what you were reading. And he said, every word is truth and more. Where can I get a copy of the book? So I told him, and he got a copy and read it. And then when I finished the book, I said, well, this is real. This is not fiction, because I recognize the names of the generals and the Air Force bases, at that time Army Air Corps, that I knew from my days in national defense. So when I decided to go public, there were two things I had to sort of get around. One was I was getting married a week later from the date of a meeting, a symposium at the University of Toronto, organized by Victor Vigiani and Mike Bird, two ufologists. And I had absolutely no intention of going whatsoever. I just was tardy and not letting them know that I wouldn't go. But after reading the book, I said, hey, I have to accept that invitation and go and stake my claim here and say my piece. So I had to phone my wife, my intended wife, my fiance then, and we were old friends. She and her late husband and my late wife and myself had been a foursome for many years, so I knew her well. But she wasn't very enthusiastic about me making a speech on the subject. But I said, well, it'll just be a one-time, one-off thing, you know.
Right.
That's the end of it. Well, I didn't intend to mislead her,
Right.
but, well, the rest is history, as the saying goes.
Right.
In the event, and then before I decided to go public, I thought I should check with the general. So I got my nephew to give him a heads up that I would be calling, and I had met him at a near show, and to give me his number. So I phoned, and even before I could say hello, he said every word was true and more.
Right.
And then he spent 20 minutes telling me the more within the limits that he could, within his oath. And one of the most important things that he told me was that there had been face-to-face meetings between U.S. officials and visitors from other star systems. Well, with that assurance, that was when I decided to go public. And I went to the meeting in Toronto and made my statement. And of course, the information just started pouring in.
From everywhere.
From everywhere, from around the world. And I got dozens and dozens of papers, some classified, some not. And I got dozens of books. And at the time, I read every single one of them. And then I got briefings. And Dr. Greer, for example, was in Toronto, wanted to see me. So we had lunch, and he gave me a 3-hour briefing that included his disclosure project and the witnesses that he had lined up to speak the truth. And then there were other ufologists that wanted to enlighten me, and there was a long, long list, and goes on. And I was briefed until I was almost saturated. And I just kept on reading the books and reading the documents and listening to the briefs and so on, and picking up information all the way along the line until not becoming a ufologist, but becoming someone who had been exposed to quite a bit of the truth.
Absolutely.
These persons had managed to pick up in the course of their studies. And then, of course, I started traveling and making a few speeches, and the United States Army sent a colonel to follow me along. At first, he said I was talking nonsense, that there were no such thing as UFOs. And then when people started to laugh at him when he said that, then he made the statement that, well, the U.S. government isn't interested in them. So he dogged me for a long while, and he was what you would call in the disinformation category. The people who have access to this information not only keep it secret, but they put out misinformation and disinformation to confuse the people, and also to mislead sometimes ufologists by giving them false information and expecting them to spread it. And then they can debunk it and say, well, it's all just a lot of nonsense.
Yes, Dan, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, Paul, when I went to Washington back in 2001 and testified along with the other witnesses, I was so naive, Paul. I had no idea of the control of the information on this, and how CNN made it sound like we wanted to have a congressional hearing based on the reality of UFOs, and CBS came in and did an interview with me, and I said, look, I'm not doing this unless I can say we have these scientists within these black projects that have a solution to get off of nuclear, oil, and coal. And they promised up and down, but the producer said to me, oh, I'm sorry, the higher executives made me cut that out. It wasn't until the year 2014 that a company in Hollywood wanted me to write an article on media control. I used to be an ex-ABC newsman. And just like you, it's like one oh my God after another, and you start to see how the whole structure has controlled our education, our mainstream media, even the entertainment industry, in order to maintain the secrecy. So I just wanted to say, yeah, it's been a matrix of perception. The whole human race has been in, and once you learn the truth, it's really our responsibility to let others know.
It's really frightening, isn't it? The degree of control
and secrecy.
Yeah, because you just mentioned the existence of technology to replace fossil fuels quickly, and that technology existed for decades.
I volunteered after the Bush administration denied the congressional hearing to bring these scientists forth. I volunteered with Dr. Greer, set up a team of a number of technical advisors because of my technical background. And for about 10 years, I went around the planet meeting with scientists and inventors to vet some of these over unity, 0 point, type of energies.
Right.
And so many of them had their lives threatened. Most of them got the national security orders, which is basically a gag order so that the public can't benefit from this. And they basically, shelve it with thousands of solutions to get off of these dangerous, polluting, toxic technologies that we have for energy have been suppressed. And that is a grave disservice to humanity.
I think it's a crime against humanity. That's what I think.
Absolutely.
Because here we are, our planet is on fire. The number one problem in the world today, I say, is global warming. The number two is the banking and financial system, but it is the most urgent, because we have to solve the banking and financial system before we have the financial flexibility to create en masse the zero point energy motors necessary to replace the engines in every car, truck, tractor, boat, plane, and home in the whole world, which is what we should be doing. And in my book, I say we should do it in 7 years. In the first book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, I said 10 years, but then 3 years went by. Now I'm saying 7 years, because if we don't, these terrible changes in the weather patterns are going to swamp so many of us. They're going to be causing all sorts of damage, including if they keep on warming up the atmosphere, the level of the ocean rising to the point where millions of people will be displaced. And these are dreadful, things that are likely, almost certain to happen if we don't get at it and do it. So some people just say, when I mentioned 7 years, they said, don't be ridiculous. And I say, I'm not ridiculous, because I've been around for a long time. And I remember very well in the World War II that we had to have more armaments and quickly. So what did we do? We converted all of the automobile plants and all of the refrigerator plants and all of the washing machine plants into armaments plants. And we created the weapons necessary to win the war. Well, we just have to do exactly the reverse today and convert the weapons plants into zero-point energy plants that would provide the fuel source, the energy source for all of these our cars, trucks, and homes that have the installations replaced. So I know that it could be done if the politicians would give it a high enough priority. But instead, we're building pipelines with a 30 to 50-year payback and acting as if nothing was going to change. And believe me, this upsets me more than I can express easily.
You have written about this in your Money Mafia book.
That's correct, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still drilling for oil in the oceans, which they shouldn't be. They're still fracking, which they shouldn't be, because nobody knows how that's going to affect the future. I keep thinking of the thalidomide thing and Agent Orange, and how we're assured all these things will have no negative effects. And it was always propaganda, just to get on with something that was going to make money. And the reality was that they were very dangerous and should have been checked out much more carefully before they were done. And in the case of the fracking, we don't need the oil. We should stop using oil and start using exotic sources of energy, such as 0 point. So we've got a lot of education necessary for the people running our planet, and there doesn't seem to be anybody in the G20 that's really leading the parade, and insofar as global warming is concerned. And this is a matter, I think, of very great regret.
So is there a light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, is there hope about what you're talking about? What can possibly change when the politicians and the big money people are in control? What can small people, I mean, like us, do? What can we do?
Well, I have a whole list of things in both the light at the end of the tunnel and the money mafia that have to be done to save the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they include saving the rainforests, massive reforestation, developing these exotic energy forms and doing it right away and installing them. But it means also getting not just a few of us, but millions of people really energized to put pressure on the politicians.
Mm-hmm.
Because the only thing that politicians understand is votes. And they won't move unless they think they're being pushed, unless there are a lot of people that want them to go in a certain direction. And so we have to create a situation where there are enough people who are genuinely concerned about the future of their home, by their home and the planet,
mm-hmm.
To say, well, look, this is no longer a laughing matter. We have to do something, and we have to do it now.
Correct.
Right now. And then put the pressure on. Not easy to accomplish, but probably the only thing we can do, because we don't really have much power when it comes to taking the cabal, as I call it, on for size. They're so powerful that only massive threats of voters would be able to do anything against their combined power.
To allow awareness to spread, it seems as though we need to take back control of our mainstream media. The faith, according to the Gallup polls last year, is there's only about 32% of the public trust the mainstream media. A lot of people are turning to stations like Monique's, for news outside of the control of the mainstream media. But so long as they can create this perception, but they keep slipping up a lot, fortunately.
Mm-hmm.
An example?
With the media, one example is, like, say, before the election, they were manipulating the polls to say there's a 98% chance that Clinton would win over Trump, for example, and then that wasn't exactly true.
No.
Not at all.
Little glitches in the matrix, you could say.
But I think your listeners have to know that the English language press, both print and electronic, is either controlled by or owned by people affiliated with the Bilderbergers. And there's a new
secret
book.
Societies.
Pardon me?
Secret societies.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a new book by Daniel Estulin. I don't know if you know that name or not, but he wrote The True Story of the Bilderbergers. And it's a splendid book I recommend to anyone who wants to sort of get inside that very secret organization and
With
and
Dick
understand
Cheney
how.
as the main part of it.
Pardon me?
Dick Cheney as main part of the Bilderbergers organizations, right? I mean,
Well, I didn't quite understand your question.
I'm saying Dick Cheney is a big part of it.
Oh well, he would be part of it. I don't think he would probably be a big part of it, but you may be right.
Yeah.
But I think if you want a bigger part, it would be David Rockefeller.
Of course.
Yeah, Paul, it's interesting. 1954 is when they started, with Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, the former SS Nazi, which that tells you something.
Right.
And just about the time Eisenhower lost control of our legal constitutional government,
Right.
that's when they started doing their yearly meetings.
Right.
Well,
And I was fortunate. Actually, I think it was divine providence, because I was told that I was going to get a call from the prince, and it never came. And so I was saved by the bell. But let me just mention who I think the Cabal are. And the Cabal, which has been running the United States for decades and much of the rest of the world, really is headed up at its apex by the banking cartel. So you follow the money, the banking cartel, and you know the people at the very top. Well, then next to that is the oil cartel. And of course, there's a lot of cross ownership. The banks own a lot of the oil stocks and so on. But the oil cartel has been trying to keep exotic energies under wrap. And they have been also creating disinformation about global warming, very much in the same way that the tobacco companies did. They just create enough uncertainty that readers would say, well, we're not sure, because we saw an article in the paper the other day that said, well, it's not really, global warming isn't really true. It's just, it's a natural cycle, or it's caused by the sun or something or other. Well, sometimes there's a little truth in some of these things, but the main problem is us. And we have been doing it to ourselves by burning so many fossil fuels.
Sure.
And so then just below the oil cartel are the heads of the transnational corporations. And again, of course, there's crossbreeding here, because most of them have loans with the banking cartel, and they're all sort of members of the same clubs in a sense.
Right.
And so there's a lot of interconnected boards, members of boards in one group from another. Well, then the next line is the intelligence agencies, or parts of them, substantial parts of them, including, of course, the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and the Israeli Mossad and the British MI6.
Sure.
And so they're all in it, and then a huge chunk of the United States military. So this is the group that has been in control since Eisenhower's day. And they're still in control. And of course, the question is whether there will be any change now or not. But it's going to be a tough nut to crack, because the extent of their control is so large and so diversified. And coming back to Estulin for a minute, in his latest book, he lists the names of all of the owners and producers and mainstream controllers of all of the English language press, and then connects it back to the Bilderberg group. So that gives you an idea of the size of the problem that we're faced with, and it's a formidable challenge. But I believe in miracles, or I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning.
Paul, I was wondering, looking back at your career, could you go back to maybe read between the lines to see evidence that things were going on behind your back in the secret military organization of U.S. and even Canadian governments?
Well, I was really not aware of very much of this until 11 years ago.
Really? Okay.
As I said, I got sighting reports when I was minister, but I was so busy unifying the Canadian Armed Forces that you mentioned in the introduction. And that's a formidable challenge, virtually impossible. I actually pulled it off at great cost to myself. It was a war of a kind, and subsequent ministers have undone most of it. Some of it still remains, but most of it has been undone. Mm-hmm. But that was what I was working at. I was going to say 24 hours a day, but let's not stretch it. For long days and long weeks when I was Minister of National Defense. Mm-hmm. And so I really didn't have time to be interested in other things and say, follow up on the sightings reports, for example, and say, well, what do you think they are? And do you know where they're coming from or anything like that? That all came later. Mm-hmm. And about my only connection to the subject before 2005 was that I was invited during our centennial year, our 100th birthday, and this year we're celebrating our 150th birthday. So that tells you how long ago it was.
Right.
But 50 years ago, I was invited because each town and city in the whole country had several meetings or galas or shows or something or other to celebrate the centennial. There was a little town in Western Canada, in Alberta, called St. Paul, a bilingual town, and they invited me to go out and dedicate the world's first flying saucer landing pad. And you can still find that on Google if you're interested enough to look.
Right.
But that was, and they were really ahead of me. I think they knew more about it than I did at the time.
Right.
I kind of thought it was a bit of a lark, and I was happy to be there and to celebrate with them. And they had more different projects than any other town in the whole country. Mm-hmm. And people sometimes think that this was in a way prophetic or had something to do with my later interest, but it just happened to be coincidental, I think. So that's on my record, and I'm happy to have it there.
Are you aware of the famous giant UFO mothership sighting in Yukon Territory, Canada in 1996, where 30 Aboriginal people reported the sighting at Fox Lake? And it's a very famous one, first encounters.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm familiar with that one. I'm familiar with the one of about 50 UFOs coming south across Europe in the 60s, when it almost created a panic because the Supreme Allied Commander Europe was concerned for fear they might be Russian.
Uh-huh.
And so he was really upset, I think, and fortunately, they turned around and flew north over the North Pole. And but as a result of that, he ordered an investigation into the whole subject that lasted 3 years, mm-hmm. and they came up with a report that, in fact, there had been at least 4 species that had been visiting Earth for thousands of years. And so,
Are these species shapeshifters or working as human-alien hybrids among us?
well, they're different things. I think there's just about everything. There are many different species.
Hmm.
How many I don't know. I remember being asked by Edgar Mitchell, who wanted to see me when he came to Canada after I went public. We invited him for dinner, and he made sort of a funny crack about the alleged landing in Roswell. And I said to him, "Come on, Edgar, it wasn't alleged," because he had come from Roswell, and so his face turned all red, and you could tell that he had been kidding me or trying to. So his next line was, "How many species do you think there are?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Somewhere between 2 and 12." He said, "Yes, that's what I think too." Well, over the years, that number has gone up.
To how much? How many?
Well, I don't know, but certainly, the range of 70 or 90,
Right.
and it will continue to go up.
Yeah.
1989, Clifford Stone said they had categorized 57
57. Yeah.
species, but we know there's more than that.
Yeah,
Speaking of,
they're bound to be, because just like Earthlings have now developed a space capability, other people have, and they will continue to develop it, and then we'll have more visitors.
sure.
So the number will keep going up rather than down.
And how can we best communicate with the ETs, and who should be the interfacer in order to represent the population of the Earth?
Well, that's a good question.
Thank you.
I don't know the answer, because I suspect that there have been meetings between, well, I know there have been meetings between U.S. officials and the United States forces have been working with aliens for decades.
Hmm.
But I don't know. I suspect that the Russians have made contact. It is possible that the Chinese have. I don't know if anyone else has or not, but I'm sure that there's, the aliens are wondering, when they say, "Take me to your leader," who they should go to, because I don't think you could find the unanimity between the United States, China, and Russia as to who the leader should be.
Right.
So you have this problem, and I don't think the United Nations is really in a position to be terribly helpful in this domain. But there's a difference between species, as you well know, and some of them look a lot like us, especially
Like
the ones in our
tall
solar
whites
system.
and Nordics. Hmm.
Pardon me?
The tall whites and the Nordics look just like us.
Yeah. And there are some that look very different.
Right.
So, sorry.
I had a question, Paul. There was mainly, back in the beginning, back several decades ago, there were basically 4 races that they were working with. Is that correct?
You mean the U.S. forces?
You talk about Eisenhower time?
Yeah. In other words, I believe there's Nordics, and then there's tall whites, and there's
Which are very
grays
similar.
and reptilians. But my understanding is the tall whites are not they look Nordic-like, but they're not necessarily
Same.
the same as the tall whites.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't know, because they've never told me, but I think that they are different species.
I bring that up because back in January of 2014, there was a post on the internet that brought your name up, saying that you were given access to Snowden's documents by Russian intelligence services, and stated that you stated they were indeed accurate. And what they were saying is that during Dwight D. Eisenhower, there was a interaction with the Nordics, but I think the agreement didn't go along with the Nordics, and so they essentially cut a deal with the Greys, which I believe were working with the reptilian group, and that the tall whites were working with the U.S. Air Force. Can you give any insight on, is that true, that internet post, that you saw these Russian intelligence documents from Snowden?
No, it's absolutely false, 100%.
Ah, thank you.
And a lot of things are said about me that are absolutely false. And that is what
CIA disinformation site.
Yeah, I think it could have been a CIA plant. They have planted a couple of things. They planted an article in the Washington Post saying that I said that the United States was run by Nazis. Well, I hadn't said that, and there was no way that they could even have known that I have ever mentioned the word unless they had been looking at my emails and the proofs of my book before it was published. So this is the kind of misinformation and disinformation that's just part of the puzzle and part of the way that the world works at the present time.
What about, according to former U.S. Congress and Pentagon consultant Timothy Good, Eisenhower had 3 secret meetings with extraterrestrials. Is that a false information, or is that in New Mexico in 1954 at the Holloman Air Force Base? Is that true, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it is true, yes.
Uh-huh.
But that's just my opinion, because again, how do you get a look at the documentation? It is, however, the consensus of probably half a dozen or more of the most respected ufologists that I know, and so I'm inclined to accept that as the truth. Yes.
And they're saying that because of this meeting, a secret regime that is currently ruling over America was established.
Say that again?
They're saying because of this particular meeting, which was life-changing, I think, for everyone. And I find it fascinating that the tall whites or grays choose United States president to meet instead of, I don't know, Spanish or French or Canadian. But
well, that was just simply because the United States, at the end of the war and certainly since, has been the most powerful military country in the world by far.
Yes. Okay. So is that possible that because of that meeting that President Eisenhower had with tall whites, or in some places says Nordics, and the Greys, the secret regime, the Cabal, was actually created that is now established over United States?
Well, I'm not sure on the timing. I think the tall whites may have come in later. I think probably President Eisenhower met with species that were not any of the 4 that were mentioned. That's just my
Oh,
guess.
really? So you're saying it was not Greys, tall whites, reptilian, or what other one did you say, Dan?
This was a possible disinformation website, is whatdoesitmean.com, and it was saying that they basically wanted to establish a global electronic surveillance system, which of course we have now with the NSA, with every which way they can of collecting our information, in order to maintain their secrecy so that the population doesn't catch on that they're going on. But this, there's so many, it's really an information war out there of deception and information. That's why I'm glad we're asking you about this, Paul, you refuted that particular post on that website is disinformation.
Yeah, just absolutely, totally false. No, I think there's a division between what I call the species that are more spiritual and who worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Ishmael, or they refer to him as the source or the one, and so on, the Great Spirit. But there are people who are, in my opinion, more spiritual than we are. And I'm not sure that that applies to all of the ones that are working with the forces. So that what they do, and they have been working through individuals. They don't have the attention of the chiefs, and probably might not want it. I don't know. That's just a speculation, I guess. But they work through individuals who then write books and make speeches and talk openly about the subject in order to get more people used to the idea that they would like to have a visit from them, because most of them belong to what they call the Galactic Federation, and they have apparently an agreement not to interfere in our affairs, except when they're invited. And in the absence of an invitation, they are using different people to spread the gospel, you might say.
So how do you think that they select the humans? On a random basis, or is it specific?
Well, I don't know, because I don't think they've ever been quoted to say how they pick them, but I think they must have some criterion that they apply. And I know from people I know who have contacts that they don't all look the same, they don't all act the same, they don't all think the same.
Mm-hmm.
They're a different, they're a good group, but they are a diverse group.
Mm-hmm. Well, has there been any other meeting since the meeting with Eisenhower that you personally are aware of?
I don't think since. I don't. When was Valiant Thor allegedly in the Pentagon? Do you remember?
Oh, right. Valiant Thor. That was back in the 50s. They offered a solution to get off of the pharmaceutical companies, but they resisted.
Well, I think they offered more than that. I think they offered us almost a paradise on Earth.
Absolutely.
If we would give up our atomic weapons.
Which we will discuss that after the break, which will coming up in just a couple minutes. And I want to talk about Robert Salas, which in 1967, and what happened with the whole nuclear missile launch. But let's talk about that in detail. It's very interesting. I interviewed Robert Salas several years ago. But I'm just kind of wondering, why would they make that kind of offer to us that, if we give up our nuclear missiles in return for heaven on earth? How would they do that?
Well, they would, because their technology is so much more advanced than ours in every way, not just weapons and transportation, but also in medicine and agriculture. And I think they were offering us cures to diseases that we would, want to have very desperately, and better ways of creating foods and all of that sort of thing. And it was all available to us. Mm-hmm. I'm told that there was some interest on the part of the politicians, but that the chiefs of staff of the United States Armed Forces were thumbs down, and that in effect their decision carried the day even then. There's a new book being written, incidentally, about the stranger in the, I think it's called Stranger in the Pentagon, about Val and his time on Earth.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, we are talking to Paul Hellyer, And I do want to give his website out again before we go on a break, which is, let's see, paulhellierweb.com. Please go to his website. You can also purchase his books, which is America in Waiting, Economic That Makes Sense, Light at the End of the Tunnel, Survival Plan for Human Species, Money Mafia, World in Crisis. You can purchase all of these at Amazon.com. I'm sure you can actually get all three of them. But also, I think we can buy them on your website. Is that correct?
Well, two of them, yes. And make a special offer tonight. The first 25 purchasers will get a personally autographed inscription in the front.
Fantastic. Dan, do you have one last? Oh, by the way, I do have a couple of questions that's coming from chat, but I'm going to kind of wait until after we come back after the break, which is probably 1 minute. Any last requests, Dan?
Oh, my question's probably a little too long before the break.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So just before we go on, let me give your website out too. The webmatrix.net. That's Dan Willis' website. We'll be right back after the break.
This is Thomas, a.k.a. a Mad Painter. I'd like you to join me.
The universe grows smaller every day, and the threat of aggression by any group, anywhere, can no longer be tolerated. Join us and live in peace, or pursue your present course and face obliteration. We shall be waiting for your answer. The decision rests with you.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you again for joining me. I'm Monique Lessan. I'm your private investigator host with Matrix of Perception on Revolution Radio, where the truth always wins. Revolution Radio is the only 100% listener-supported radio, so please go to our website, www.freedomslips.com, and click Donate. If you want to dial, well, let me just give you dial to listen numbers that are available 24/7 for Studio A. 712-432-6958. That is how you can listen from anywhere in the United States. There is a charge involved with that. If you want to join the conversation at any time tonight, call us at 347-688-2902. You can also put your questions on chat or Skype, Monster 383, also Freedom Screen. That's how you can come on board and join the conversation. Tonight, my co-host is Dan Willis. His website is thematrix.net. And, of course, my very favorite special guest is former Minister of Defense of Canada, Honorable Paul Hellyer. I want to welcome both of you back to the show. Thank you so much for being with Matrix of Perception.
It's a very great pleasure.
Thank you. We were talking, of course, about so many different subjects, but the last thing that I guess we left it at was, help me out, Dan, where did we leave it? I think we were talking about well, let me just ask this. I was asking earlier, why do the ETs don't go to someone more important, like a president, to make a bigger impact rather than individuals? And you were saying, Paul, that they go to individuals, any random people with special gifts, perhaps, and so they can pass on the information to the rest of the people around the world. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the way the system works, I think.
Mm-hmm. Why not go to a president or someone more important? It doesn't have to be a president, but someone that has more influence than just maybe the security guard at some Walmart.
Well, I think they're very perceptive. They know what's going on. They can read our minds. And they probably know as well as we do that there hasn't been a president since Truman that's really been in control of the United States. Mm-hmm. So why would they go to the president instead of to some high-up person in the cabal?
Mm-hmm.
As we discussed earlier,
right.
The cabal has pretty well made its bed as far as who it's working with. So anybody that isn't included in their circle has to find another outlet. And they're the ones that are going to individuals and so on. I have a very good friend who is a channeler and a healer. And he has made contact with a group, with a species that is not well known called the Pesetas. And they are very tall and wear white robes, looking very much like monks. And they have healed one or two of his friends, come around his bed at night and healed him of various things. But also they have dictated to my friend a book. And so he is, there may be other people who've done this, but he is the first person I know who has written a book that was dictated by one species of the extraterrestrials.
On Earth.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. It's called Out of This World. Mm-hmm. I think it's available from Amazon. And
I've heard about that book. I was told to read that book.
Yeah, I found it fascinating because they give you a lot of advice, and they also pretty well say what the other extraterrestrials say, and that is that we're on a collision course with disaster, mm-hmm. unless we change trajectory. And they point out that it wouldn't be the first time that the human species has been wiped out, and that if so, it would start over again at some stage. Mm-hmm. But I think they try to encourage us to change our ways in the hope that we can do it soon enough to rescue our planet from destruction and to rescue it from having some lunatics in high places in the military who are crazy enough to think that they could start a nuclear war and win. As we
were speaking on the first hour, in March of 1967, Captain Robert Salas was stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana as a nuclear missile launch officer controlling 10 nuclear-tipped missiles. I know that you spoke with Mr. Salas. Do you want to tell me that story, or you want me to kind of let everyone know?
I can tell you the story of where I met him.
Yes, please tell me.
I met him in Hawaii.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
At a conference there where we were both presenting.
Are you talking Michael Salas or Robert Salas?
Robert Salas.
Okay, Robert Salas. Okay.
Is that who we're talking about?
Yes. Well, because Michael Salas lives in Hawaii too. He's
Michael Salas was putting on the show.
Oh, okay.
He was our host.
Okay.
And his wife. And so we arrived there, and under sort of the tutelage of Mike Bird, who I mentioned was one of the people that sponsored the meeting where I first spoke out. And we asked Mike where we could find a good restaurant to have dinner first night. And he pointed to one down the street, and he said, we said, come along with us, which he did. And just as we were getting there, he pointed out Michael Salas, he's Robert Salas, and his wife, and said he's presenting. And so they came up and we invited them to join us.
Right.
So I met him before hearing his presentation. And of course, he told me a lot of the things that he was going to say in his presentation.
Yes.
And our paths have crossed a number of times since. We were both witnesses in Washington in 2013 at the Citizens Disclosure hearing. And I have met him on other occasions and listened to his story of how a UFO came to their base and was reported to him. He was underground at the time, and he had to go through the drill of what to do and all of that sort of thing. And unfortunately, in a sense, a number of the missiles went unserviceable.
Right, the no-go condition, unlaunchable. That's right.
And so there was a big, there were many investigations afterwards, including one I think could have been Lockheed Aircraft, by one of the aircraft companies anyway. And I don't think they ever did come to a conclusion. My own suspicion is that the missiles were put out of operation, not deliberately, but by the electromagnetic effect of the
UFOs
itself, getting too close to the controls. And I can't prove that, but that's just something that I would sort of think might have happened.
So basically, what you're saying is that if the ETs interfered for our own good to shut down the missiles, that would be an interference which would actually go against the rules of non-interference. Is that correct?
Well, it is correct, but they are very, very concerned about us. I think they look at us as children playing with matches.
I have some input on that. Robert Salas shared with me they shown a beam of light or some type of plasma beam or something that was emitted from the craft down into the missile silo, similar to Larry Warren said that there was a beam that was shooting down, and they weren't supposed to have nukes over there in the UK, but they shut down or they reprogrammed, or it did something to manipulate with the nuclear weapons over there in Brentwaters.
It's my view that the extraterrestrials, and I don't know if it's one species or more than one, have taken an inventory of every nuclear installation on the planet.
Right.
Thank God.
So they just by the fact that they show up, perhaps the magnetic field around it will shut down the missiles rather than. So you just made a very interesting point, because if they actually did it for us and shut it down, that would be part of the interference, even though we are little children and they're trying to protect us.
Well, they're trying to protect the planet too.
It's true, absolutely.
Because they like the planet the way it is. They like to be able to visit it.
Right. It might be their planet. It might have been their original planet in the first place.
Well, you never know, but at least there are various reasons why they may want to come here.
Right.
And they don't want us to spoil it.
So tell me what it is. Why are they here, in your opinion? Why would they want to come back?
Well, they might be here for their summer holidays. Or they might want to get some of our resources.
Right.
They might want some samples of our food. They might want some gold. There are a lot of things that they might want. And I'm not sure that they would all want the same thing. So I think, again, a generalization is dangerous, because they are probably like any of the rest of us, and some of us would like a beefsteak, and some of us would like a lamb, and some of us would like vegetarian dinner, and so on. So they probably have different reasons for wanting us to protect the planet. But I think that they have in common with most of us anyway, the desire to preserve it as a habitable place for humans as well as for the visitors.
Sure.
And if that's true, I say more power to them.
Was John F. Kennedy assassinated because he was on the verge of telling the public the truth about UFOs?
Well, you'd have to ask the people that plotted it if that was the reason. It could have been one of the reasons. Certainly, I think he felt that more of the truth should be exposed, and he had to live with, at least temporarily, with some people who didn't agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So just what the final straw was, I'm not sure. I know that he and the CIA had a very bad relationship. They felt that he interfered in the Bay of Pigs, and I think he felt that they shouldn't have been there in the first place. And so there was tension between them, and I think this tension may have gotten out of hand, and with disastrous results. But I heard something on the television last night that upset me a little bit, and that is that the CIA can listen to what I'm saying through my cell phone or through my television set.
Yes, they can.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the NSA has backdoors to everything. I had a question, Paul. Back in 2001, as one of the 21 witnesses, of which there was, Dr. Greer did an incredible job of collecting over 450 military intelligence witnesses that were, backing behind us. And once we did that, it inspired like Dr. Michael Salla and Gary McKinnon, the UK hacker who hacked into Space Command and saw evidence of what appears to be a secret space program. So my question is, I became very familiar with probably about 100 of the witness testimonies in detail. And all that made sense. It all put all the pieces of the puzzle together for me and laid out a picture after, going into historical research. But since that time, new whistleblowers have been coming out regarding a secret space program, such as William Tompkins. Are you familiar with some of his testimonies?
I've heard the name. I'm not sure that I know exactly what he's been saying.
All right. They've been collaborating, the witness testimony. Now, what they're coming out with is pretty much of a far stretch for the average person or the imagination. It's one thing what we were disclosing back in 2001, and now what they're coming out with, outlandish technologies that could going this 20 years and back, where they're able to time regress people and bring them back through time and do 20 years of military service into these secret space programs. And they're gaining a lot of attention. I've done some work with Dr. Michael Salla on collaborating on some of the Freedom of Information docs that William Tompkins, who worked with the Navy, has come out with, and everything's matching up. I know Dr. Greer is back in November last year. He said that anybody that talks about any extraterrestrial race that seems to be non-benevolent, they've been given false screen memories. They have that technology to do that, but it's kind of a far stretch for me since I've seen much of the documentation with William Tompkins that backs up. He's in his 90s as well, and his story is quite collaborated, and it's quite remarkable, and could open up a whole new understanding of what's been hidden from the human race.
Personally, I don't dismiss anything. That is my modus vivendi. So I do not say anything is impossible, because I think almost anything is possible. And
I agree with you.
the question is whether I know about it or don't know about it. One of the best lines in my book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, was I said, I didn't know how much I didn't know because I didn't know how much there was to know.
Well put.
That's right.
Well, that is as true today as it was when I wrote it,
Right.
because this stuff keeps opening up so fast with things that normally you would say, well, that's impossible, or that's stupid, or that's, beyond the pale. I say, don't say that until you know, because it could, in effect, be correct. Just reserve judgment until you know.
That's right. And do your research. I think most people don't do their research.
Well, no, and most people don't read books too. That's one of the problems in both Canada and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
People don't have the luxury of the time to be able to do the research. That's the only reason I was able to catch up, because some company wanted me to do an article on mainstream media control, being an ex-ABC newsman, when I started to dig back through to the beginning of the 20th century and starting to connect all the dots chronologically and how they all fit together with authenticated, documents and the witness testimonies. I mean, you can't fake hundreds of witness testimonies and with collaborating documentation. You just can't do it.
With generals and admirals and all those important people.
Oh, yeah. Admirals, generals, astronauts, like
Sure.
Edgar Mitchell. All collaborating, but, it's a sea of disinformation out there as well. So you have to reference to what makes sense.
That's right. And more things are making sense because the technology is changing very rapidly. And I know in the weapons field, too, that there have been some developments that, in my opinion, should make war obsolete. It should be declared out, period. We've been doing this for 6,000 years, building empires, using military might. And in every war, the killing machines have been more deadly. And of course, we had the atomic bomb in the last war. And then it just keeps on going, that they have weapons that are so much worse in their possible effects than small atomic weapons, that it's almost difficult to describe or to conceive of where they could be used or why anyone would want to use them and what the possible consequences might be of really using them. So I don't dismiss anything, and I was talking to somebody very knowledgeable the other day, was talking about a cancer cure and the doctors being able to reverse the time of the cells in order to change the nature of the human and, in effect, cure the cancer.
That's amazing.
So, and this is a very reputable person who told it to me, and I believe it. So we have to keep an open mind. There are some other subjects we haven't even touched, and that is the most urgent one, which is the banking system. And I don't know if you want to talk about that now or not, but
let's bring Olive. He's been holding to ask you a question, and we'll get back to the banking system right after that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I got 4 questions. I don't know where to start, but hello, Paul. Thank you, Monique, for taking my call. Hello.
No problem.
Dan and
Your most
Richard.
important question, just so
okay,
you know, Olive.
well, then I'm going to have to go down the rabbit hole. Could you, since the North Pole is up there by you, what do you know, or if you're allowed to talk about it, I don't know how much stuff you could talk about, Admiral Richard Byrd's expedition and him meeting those tall whites who say that nuclear weapons can be no more. Go ahead.
Are you talking about the expedition to Antarctica?
Not the Antarctica, but the other, the Arctic Circle.
No, I'm not familiar with that one.
North Pole.
Yeah.
Well, this is actually a great point. What do you know about everyone who's going to Antarctica at this point?
Well, I'd like to
including
know
John
why they
Kerry.
don't,
Yeah.
because I know the Germans had a base there at the end of the war.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that Admiral Byrd went down to try and do something about it and was repulsed, presumably by flying saucers. And that I think there's something still going on down there, and whether it's an active base or not, and who's in charge, and whether there are some remnants of earlier civilizations and all of this sort of thing, I don't know, but I'm as curious as the next person.
Right.
And I would
so you don't know much about Operation High Jump or Operation Freeze?
No, I can't remember all the.
Okay, so here,
yeah.
let me just say this, and then I'll back out.
Okay.
How about John Lamb Lash? You know, he talks about the Archons who actually run one of the world governments as mind parasites, and that they talk about it in the Nag Hammadi as well. I don't know if you ever heard of that word, or if you ever heard of the Archons, and as advanced races physically, but not spiritually.
Ancient race?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've heard the word. I just don't know anything about them.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Monique.
You're welcome. Come back next time too. Okay, so we have someone on the line, Erico 707.
Hello, hi, Mr. Hellyer. Thanks for coming on the show. I had a question. You were talking about one world order earlier, and so it brought up the thought that, and I wonder what you think about this, that to take me to your leader question, since we don't really have one, if you look, the Cabal, and historically it's gone far back, has been talking about a one world order. And of course, you were in a high cabinet position in a government. There's been an attempt to coalesce the governments. And I'm wondering if this could be something that the aliens need this one authority for a planet to do interplanetary negotiation, communication, and to go public. And that the Cabal is trying to seize the opportunity, and maybe the aliens are more concerned about that stability because as a human race we're so unpredictable, disordered, and destructive. And any agreements they make now could just be erased with change of governments or war. So, but the other worry I have is if they did do the one world order, could that be something where it could be orchestrated by an alien species to come in and put hybrids or puppets in control, and then we essentially can lose control of our destiny? So I'm wondering what you think about that, and I had one other question after that.
I think it's a very good question, and it could be that there's collaboration between the Cabal and one or more species.
Mm-hmm.
This has been talked about, and Phil Snyder indicated that there was a very close collaboration in what he called the New World Order, and said he would never have served underground if he had known what was going on. But I think there is the sort of feeling of maybe there might be a cross or double cross. And one side thinks they're going to come out on top, and maybe the other side also thinks they're going to come out on top.
Exactly. And others are sitting back and watching, and they, yeah.
And the thing that I fear is that the rest of us are going to be left on the hill somewhere with eating bread and soup.
Eating grass, living in caves, exactly. So, but it seems also that if they were to go public now, if you put that in perspective, that of course it could create that kind of chaos as to who makes agreements and vying for power and such, and they need to have the one world order coalesced. The question is if it's benevolent aliens even using the Cabal to get it in there and then settle down the human species and get rid of the weapons. So
the problem with me is I don't like dictatorships.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like I hate to use the word fascist, but I don't like fascist governments.
Mm-hmm.
That leads to the other question I had, which have you been able to at all use your former position and your connections with past leaders and other military attaché that you were in contact with? Of course, maybe some of them are retiring, but to either get them to begin to cooperate with you or to bring together a little more authority and a little more of a push from people who used to be in your cloak, your order of government.
No, I have some military sources which I use to confirm or deny things that I want to know. But I certainly am not going to take the Cabal on for size. And that, if you're talking about having an alternate group to try and do a parallel operation with them, they're so deeply entrenched.
Absolutely, it's too dangerous as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There was an old saying, Paul, about he who has the gold makes the rules. What do you know about Bitcoin or Bitgold? Because you're wanting to get into the financial thing.
Yeah, well, I want to stay away from that, except to say I think we should be very concerned about what's going on in the financial world and what they may have in store for us. This goes back a long way. And I usually start with the incorporation of the Bank of England. The king was fighting a war in France, King William, and he wasn't doing very well. And he needed to refurbish his armed forces, especially the Navy. But his credit was no good, so somebody suggested, well, why don't you form a bank? And he got Parliament to approve the Bank of England, and the rich people put in £1,200,000 of gold and silver and lent the whole thing to the king at 8%, which is a pretty high interest rate for a government-guaranteed loan. Well, then, to show his appreciation or to fulfill a promise to get them to cooperate, and we'll probably never know which it was. Might have been a bit of both. He said you can print, print, £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend them to your rich friends. And so, in effect, they were allowed to lend the same money to two different people at the same time, the king and their friends, and collect interest from each. And this is where was born what they later called the partial reserve system of banking. Well, then, through the years, through the avarice of the banks and the cooperation or collusion of the politicians, the ratio, which was then 2-to-1, became much more generous. In the early years of the 19th century, the early years of the 20th century, I guess it was in the United States, federally incorporated banks had to have a gold reserve of 25%. So they were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. In Canada, when I was young, our banks had to have a cash reserve of 8%, which meant they could lend the same money 12.5 times. Well, then along comes Milton Friedman with his sort of let the banks do their own thing. And the ratios went up, first of all, in the United States to about 30 or 35, and then that's too high, so they were brought down to about 20 to 1, and they can lend the same money to 20 different individuals and collect interest on it from each one of the 20 people. Now, this, in my opinion, is grand larceny. It's just it's a fraud. It's a total fraud. It's just one great big Ponzi scheme. And somehow they've coerced the politicians to go along with it. But we're in the position now where they have given to the private bankers a monopoly to create money. So this money that the bankers create is all created as debt. And it's debt that has to be repaid with interest. but nobody creates any money with which to repay either the capital or the interest. So it's a dead end. And anybody that can't see that, I just say is numerically challenged. So we've got to do something very different. And we have to, and because the debt now is higher than at any time in the history of the world, we have got to somehow get a huge infusion of government-created debt-free money to dilute the debt and to provide nation states with the flexibility to keep their promises, to provide jobs, to build these zero-point energy motors, and to do the other things that are absolutely essential. So what we have to do is change the system totally. And in our country, we're lucky because we own our central bank. We have a system for this sort of thing. We went in 1938, and I happen to be old enough to remember that. There were no jobs in Canada. In 1939, the war came along, and all of a sudden, everyone was working. They were in the armed forces, the Army, Navy, or Air Force, or they were building factories, or they were making munitions. And you may say, well, where did the government get the money to do all of those things? Well, the answer is that the Bank of Canada, our central bank, printed it, printed. And they bought government bonds and paid for them with newly minted cash. Well, then the government paid them very low interest on the bonds, but then the Bank of Canada paid it all back to the government as dividends with just the cost of administration deducted. So in effect, it was near zero cost money. And we had this system which got us out of the Great Depression and then helped us really do a remarkable job during the war for a small nation. We developed into a diversified economy and evolved from a rural commodity-based economy into a mixed economy with a good manufacturing base and so on. And then after the war, we used the Bank of Canada to help us build our new infrastructure. And this included the St. Lawrence Seaway, our part of it, and the Trans-Canada Highway, and then the Dew Line. You probably recognize that. There was a distant early warning line which went right around the periphery of the north to advise us of the possibility of incoming Russian planes. Very expensive. We paid for all of that, as well as provincial and municipal major projects, and laid the foundation for an excellent social security system, and wound up with no debt, practically no debt. Well, then in 1974, our bank was taken in by the Bank for International Settlements, which is under the control of the Cabal, under the control of the money cartel. And they stopped lending us cheap money. It was part of the deal. And we had to start borrowing in the market. And so as a result of that, especially after two recessions that Paul Volcker and his Canadian counterpart brought on in 1981-82, when they pushed interest rates to 18% in the United States and 22% in Canada, and then another one in 1991. They crushed the economies, did terrible damage socially and financially. And this debt thing that we're stuck with now was really given a huge boost because at 20% interest rate, the debt doubles every 4 years. So we've got ourselves now in a position, and incidentally, in the years since 1974, when this change was made, the Canadian taxpayers have had to pay $1.17 trillion, that's trillion, and converted into US, that would be probably 15 trillion in interest, none of which was really necessary. And now we have debt, 615 billion.
Hey, Paul, are we the money? I mean, when it comes down to it, since the debt's put on us, and you just said 15 trillion there in Canada, or would be equivalent to the American dollar. Would you say that we are the debt, the people of the debt, and there was the Rothschilds involved?
Well, I think all of the big banking families were involved. And when they have this leverage of 20, which I was talking about, the flip side of that is that they can buy up assets for $5 on the 5 cents on the dollar. And they've been doing that. And 3 years ago, 88 families owned half of all of the wealth in the whole world. The following year was 80 families. In 2016, it was 62 families. Owned half of all of the wealth in the world. I can't get my mind around this. And I start talking about it. I talk about the big cities, say in Asia, the New Delhi and Beijing and Peking, and you jump across the pond and have Vancouver and San Francisco and Los Angeles, and then come across to New York, Philadelphia, Toronto, Montreal, and all of the big cities, and then jump across the pond again to Manchester and London, and then Paris and Bonn. And every second one of those cities is owned lock, stock, and barrel by 62 families that you could put on a suburban street. Now that's the mess we're in today, and it's getting worse. And that's the reason I say that we have to have a revolution in the system, and governments have to start creating a lot of money and putting it into circulation. And the Canadian precedent, which I have in my book, The Money Mafia, calls for putting in the equivalent of 5% of the total bank deposits every year for 7 years, and making the banks build up cash reserves again, because they changed the system, went away from cash reserves and went on what they call capital reserves, capital adequacy, which of course proved to be capital inadequacy, because after the meltdown of 2007 and 8, brought on deliberately by Wall Street, they had to get first of all, the government of the United States to bail them out to the tune of, I think it was $700 billion. But then after it was an audit of the Fed, I guess it was Ron Paul who was really responsible for that. And of course, it's ridiculous that the Fed isn't subject to supervision. But they created trillions and trillions of dollars to make available to their favorite banks and their favorite businesses. And, this is an unholy mess. That's what it is.
We've been scammed, Paul. I think you're right about a critical mass awareness needs to happen for this order to change. It's like there's so many people after generation. You've seen so many generations. You've seen the changes. I think you even met with Kennedy.
I did have the privilege of meeting him, yes.
Wow, that's great. Mm-hmm.
He was trying to get us off the Federal Reserve and get us out of Vietnam so I wouldn't have to go there back in the 60s. But with the control of the mainstream media and the new generation who doesn't have a clue about what you're talking about, they're just doing their daily life and watching what they do. And so it's through the alternative media of the internet, it seems, that Brzezinski was afraid of, that there's this global awakening happening, that enough critical mass, as you brought out in your, I think it was in the beginning of 2015, you gave a warning about a grave danger from an enemy within the United States. So basically, this infiltration of this cabal, that we can transform the situation.
Absolutely, and unless something is done very soon, I think the situation is going to get worse instead of better. Because now, coming back to the coins, I think the Fed is going to change its ways of doing things, but I think what they have in mind for us is a cashless society and maybe even a total meltdown and a new currency, a new virtual currency, which would cause a catastrophe that would make the Great Depression look like a Sunday school picnic.
Virtual currency. What does that look like?
Well, that's what all of your money looks like, because only about 3% of your money is legal tender, and the rest is all nothing but computer entries.
Sure.
So all of our money is virtual money. It's make-believe money.
Of course, yeah.
And that's the reason that
I think that people don't come forward and make that change, Dan, like you were saying, because they're afraid.
Because they don't understand it too. They don't really understand how the system works. And it was Henry Ford who said, if the people knew how the banking system works, it'd be a revolution by morning. Well, he was probably exaggerating a little bit, but certainly the people would say, hey, this is robbery. And if the system that goes on, it's just like us being a bunch of sheep being taken in to be shorn every year.
And think what a boost to the economy it would be, with millions and millions of jobs, if we release this technology and retrofit all of our obsolete, dangerous, polluting technologies we've been using.
Well, absolutely, especially if you have the government create the money for it rather than having to borrow it, so that it's paid for, and that's the end of it. And you don't have to say we have to pay it back with interest, which has been the problem for the last, increasingly for 300 years.
May I interrupt you? I only have a few minutes. I promise someone who has been asking me to ask you a question. It may not have anything to do with what we're talking about, but because we are at the end, I do want to ask that question.
That's fine.
He's actually one of the talk radio hosts on Revolution Radio. He wants to know if you know any knowledge of Dr. Fred Bell research.
Dr. Fred Bell?
Yes.
I don't think so.
Yeah, okay. I asked.
I knew Dr. Bell, and I did some exchanges with him, so I can pick that up later.
Oh, really? Okay, so at least you can talk to him. I'll connect you with him.
Okay.
Okay, please continue.
Well, I pretty well shot my bolt on that, but we have to go. We have to do something very, very quickly, because I think that the Cabal are afraid that we'll catch on, and that they want to do something dramatic, and we have to cut them off at the pass. That's
right.
No problem. And under the proposal that I have in my book, the new money that would be created by the government, especially for the 7 years until the reserve funds were built up in the banks, would be split 50-50 between the federal government and the states. So the states would have the money to help municipalities and to do the things that they really have not been able to do during this 9-year recession, which was, as I said, brought on deliberately by Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
And
Paul, I have always, I apologize for cutting you off. Because I have a tiny bit of time, I've always been interested in one subject. A lot of people know about that, and they know about me and my passion about this. So I want to get that question in if I can.
Okay.
And this is something that just came to my attention. I speak about children a lot on my things that I'm involved with. I want to go back to the ET exchange for a minute with Eisenhower. A lot of people talking about the exchange between reverse engineering versus people abductions of people, general public, I guess. Could that general public also specifically involve experiments on children, abduction of children and experiments on them? Because I don't know if you know or not, but at least 300,000 children go missing from North America alone. That's a low part, and more.
There are a lot of people I know who are interested in this subject who had experiences when they were very young children.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They were 4 or 5 or 6 years old when they had their first experience. So I guess the answer to your question is yes.
Are we talking about aliens or governments kidnapping of children for experiments?
Well, I think, well, you never know the answer to the question for sure. I think certainly for a while, it was the aliens, and governments may have done the same thing later when they had the capability to do it. I just don't know.
Right. Okay. Dan, if you don't have any questions, I want to make sure that, again, I want to introduce your books, Paul, one more time. So we're talking about several books. American Waiting Economics That Makes Sense, Light at the End of the Tunnel, and that's a survival plan for human species, and of course, Money Mafia, World in Crisis, available at Amazon.com and also Author House USA. You can also purchase the books at paulhellyerweb.com. If you want to contact Paul, I guess the best way to do it is go to your website, right, Paul?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Very good.
And
Dan?
as I said before,
yeah.
First 25 orders I get, I will provide with personally autographed inscriptions in the front of the book, just as a little bonus.
Okay.
I just want to say, I hope in the white hats that are in our CIA, NSA, and military that we have some help in all this, Paul.
Well, there is help. As you know, there's a great difference of opinion within the military, and there's some within the CIA. They're not all homogeneous or homogenous, whichever you prefer. But the question is, who's on top? Who's pulling the strings? And one of the reasons we have to change the banking system is, I think, if we're going to do anything, we have to end their power, their monopoly, because they are now in charge. But if we reduce their leverage from 20-to-1 to 2-to-1, which I'm proposing in the book, then instead of being able to buy assets for 5 cents on the dollar, they'll have to pay 50 cents. And their power over us will have disappeared. And the bankers will be really more like public utilities. And they will still have enough money to look after the important things, like helping small businesses grow and the things that they should be doing, lending money to individuals. But they won't have the money for use it for a world casino.
Thanks for taking my call.